One of the most perfect short stories ever written, and one to tease us out of thought, is Edward Murek's Mozart auf der Reise nach Prag, Mozart on the Journey to Prague. The young composer in the story is writing Don Giovanni hastily for its premiere in Prague just a few days away. The Bohemian city has gone wild over his Marriage of Figaro, a comedy about the ironies and ecstasies of love, and has called for more of the same. So Mozart's new opera will also concern itself with the many guises of love, and with the most famous of all mythic lovers, Don Juan. Some of the new music will remind us of the innocence of childhood, Mozart's own memories of the sea at Naples, where youths and maidens in bright little boats tossed golden balls like oranges back and forth in a stylized kind of love game. But other pages of music will be terrifying and bring us face to face with death. Mozart's carriage halts. He wanders down the road to an Italian-style castle. Orange trees, a splashing fountain. For just once in his life, the innocent but tormented young genius, soon to burn himself out in the flames of his own inspiration, experiences a moment of pure repose. Remembering his childhood, he plucks an orange, like Adam from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or like Apollo from the tree of the Muses. The golden ball comes gently in his hand. He cuts it in half with a little silver knife, and admires the perfect inner surfaces. He joins them gently, very gently, then separates them, then joins them again. We know that he soon will die. This is Father Owen Lee, someone who fell in love with Mozart's opera when he was very young, and has since had many occasions to remark that Don Giovanni, more than any opera save perhaps only Tristan and Isolde, has caught the imagination of artists, composers, poets, philosophers, psychologists, men of letters, and music lovers. Rossini, when the great singer Pauline Viardot showed him the autograph score, fell to his knees weeping, kissed the music, and exclaimed of its composer, he was God himself. Bruno Walter confessed, I discovered beneath the playfulness a dramatist's inexorable seriousness and wealth of characterization. I recognized in Mozart the Shakespeare of opera. Goethe thought that only the man who had written Don Giovanni could set his masterpiece Faust to music. Kierkegaard exclaimed over Don Giovanni, Immortal Mozart, you to whom I owe it that I have not gone through this life without being profoundly moved. E.T.A. Hoffmann, he of the Tales, called Don Giovanni the opera of all operas, and for some 2 centuries Mozart's opera has pretty well kept that title unchallenged. And yet Don Giovanni is a work full of contradictions. Robert Kraft is not alone in saying that while the music is some of Mozart's greatest, the opera itself is imperfect in conception, a miscarriage as drama, that the libretto is disjointed, marred by implausible incidents, peopled mainly with one-dimensional figures, and confused in its moral position. The truth is, we have never been able to form an adequate idea of what Don Giovanni is. It defies classification. The librettist, that witty rascal Lorenzo da Ponte, wanted it to be an out-and-out comedy, with the vis comica, the comic force of the old Roman clown Plautus. At least that's what he told his doctor years later, adding that it was Mozart who was set on making it serious. Da Ponte may for once have been telling the truth. We know that Mozart always took a hand in the shaping of his librettos, and that in the course of writing Don Giovanni he also wrote the poignant string quintets in C minor and G minor, and had lost the father who had loved and bullied him all his life. Something of this seriousness is in Don Giovanni, which begins with the death of a father, in a scene with a special poignancy in the string writing. All the same, Mozart entered Don Giovanni in his personal catalogue as an opera buffa, the standard name for 100 years for comic opera. It is called on the title page a dramma giocoso, a humorous drama, a designation that, despite the ink spilt over it, solves no problems of interpretation. So what shall we say? Let's say first that Don Giovanni is built from elements of the medieval morality play, that allegorical struggle between good and evil, and from the Punch and Judy farces, the carnival puppet shows, the presentations of strolling players, in which the Don Juan myth seems first to have surfaced. In Vienna, there had been All Souls' Day performances of Don Juan the Dissolute Man Punished for as long as anyone in Mozart's day could remember. Some of the Don Juan myth may have grown, too, out of the escapades of a 17th century historical figure, Don Juan de Tassis, Count of Villa Mediana, and the opera owes much, too, to a literary tradition. A play by the Spanish monk Tirso de Molina, a remarkable piece in which almost all of Da Ponte's elements are already present, and other plays by Molière in France, Shadwell in England, Goldoni in Italy. Through all of these one can sense the old cautionary tale turning rationalistic. Don Juan was becoming less a dissolute sinner punished, and more a hero in revolt against conventional morality. But of all the sources, Da Ponte's libretto owes most to a Don Giovanni that had only recently opened in his own Venice, with a text by Giovanni Bertati. Da Ponte kept quiet about his indebtedness there, and went out of his way to denigrate Bertati, his most important predecessor. But he needn't have. The whole Don Juan tradition is a succession of borrowings. Even Mozart seems, in his haste, to have borrowed a musical idea or two from Bertati's composer Giuseppe Gazzaniga. Musically, Don Giovanni draws equally on two quite separate traditions: opera buffa, a popular genre fast coming into prominence, and opera seria, an aristocratic tradition fast becoming obsolete. Mozart had already combined the two in The Marriage of Figaro, where the opera buffa figures of the servants interact with the opera seria figures of the count and countess. But in Figaro, based on a solid stage-worthy play by Beaumarchais, the two elements are under much firmer control. In Don Giovanni they run riot, so much so that the opera came to mean something different wherever it was shown. In the Latin countries it was a comedy, thrown slightly out of whack by its composer's insistence on feeling for his characters. In the Germanic countries it was a tragedy, in which a hero like a force of nature, a demonic, even satanic force, rose heroically to challenge God himself. Don Giovanni became a kind of Hamlet or Faust, inexhaustible, which certainly would have surprised Da Ponte, who never gave his hero a moment's reflection, and sketched him in conversation with an exhausted Don Juan of the day named Casanova. In Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman, Don Giovanni became the incarnation of an evolutionary life force, which certainly would have surprised Mozart, who gave his hero mostly low opera buffa music to sing. Today we are even more at a loss to interpret Mozart's opera. Our trendy directors see its hero not as a swashbuckler intent on his pleasures, but as a perpetual adolescent needing instant gratification, or as a latent homosexual who actually hates women, or as an anti-hero intent on evil, or as an Oedipus figure, slaying an interfering father and seducing one unsatisfactory mother after another. Our critics can go even farther. Winthrop Sargent, in the pages of Opera News, argued, not unconvincingly, that Mozart's hero was a fertility god, and that to attend Don Giovanni was to participate in the celebration not of a performance, but of a ritual. Wagner never claimed any more for Parsifal. So you be the judge. Do you think these opening measures in the key of D minor fit the puppet show, the opera buffa, the dramma giocoso? think when you turn the page to this main section of the overture, you are listening to the titanic struggle of Satan against God, or of Oedipus against his father. Clearly, parts of Don Giovanni are opera seria, and other parts opera buffa. But, as you will hear in this performance under Carlo Maria Giulini, the work as a whole is something more than the sum of its parts. It is comedy vividly thrown into tragic relief. It is at least the partial embodiment of all the theories. Its ambiguities have been its glory. After Mozart, other versions of the Don Juan myth continued to pour forth, from the likes of Byron and Baudelaire, de Musset and Mérimée, Pushkin and Tolstoy, but there was never any question that the great treatment of the subject was Mozart's tragicomic opera. The action begins in the garden of a palace in a city that is probably 17th century Seville. It is night. A commoner paces up and down, wrapped in a cloak, complaining that he has to watch night and day while the master is busy with his pleasures. Why can't he be the gentleman for a change? Here is Giuseppe Taddei as that commoner, Leporello.
Piova il vento sopportar, mangia il male mal dormir.
Notte e giorno faticar, night and day I'm worked to death. Years later, the old Beethoven worked the phrase into his Diabelli variations as a jibe at the publishers who never let him rest. Then Offenbach used the phrase at the start of the Tales of Hoffmann, where the poet's companion sings it to his master. There is scarcely a number in Mozart's opera that is not similarly quoted in the art, music, and literature still to come. Suddenly, while the servant makes unseemly comments, the master appears, a dashing figure, lavishly dressed, concealing his face, and not entirely able, in his flight, to escape the lady who is struggling with him and calling for help. Don Giovanni has ravished, or attempted to ravish, Donna Anna. In a moment her father, a royal commander of armies, the Commendatore, is there, with his sword drawn, and though the father is now advanced in years, the young Giovanni is compelled to fight him. Anna rushes off, and soon her father falls mortally wounded. Many writers have suggested that the death of his own father unleashed in Mozart some dark force, a kind of demonic clang in the music associated with the dying Commendatore, who returns as a messenger from another world at the opera's end. Beethoven copied out the poignant passage where the father dies, and remembered it when he wrote his Moonlight Sonata. The musical resemblance between the two moonlit passages is unmistakable, though Beethoven's is a romantic piano landscape, and Mozart's a sinister trio for three dark male voices. In this case, Giuseppe Taddei, Gottlob Frick as the dying Commendatore, and as Don Giovanni himself, Eberhard Wächter.
Yeah.
Then, abruptly, everything changes. The orchestra stops playing, a harpsichord strikes up, and Leporello and his master begin singing in recitative, Mozart's usual shorthand for quick passages of dramatic development. And with the change from orchestra to harpsichord, the tragic drama turns suddenly, if not comical, at least sardonically cynical, and wind-swift. Leporello murmurs through the darkness, "Who's dead, you or the old man?" Giovanni whispers, "Idiot, the old man, of course." Leporello exclaims, "Bravo! 2 charming projects, rape the daughter and murder the father." Giovanni shouts, "It's what he asked for." Leporello jokes, "And Donna Anna, did she get what she asked for?" "Shut up," says the master, "or you'll get something like it yourself." "Oh, I've nothing to say," says the servant. Here is that recitative.
Chi è morto, voi o il vecchio? Che domanda da bestia, il vecchio. Bravo, 2 imprese leggiadre, sforzar la figlia ed ammazzare il padre. L'ha voluto, suo danno. Madonna Anna, cosa ha voluto? Taci, non mi seccar. Vien meco se non vuoi qualche cosa ancor tu. Non vuoi nulla, signor, se non parlo più.
In quick strokes, in brutal dialogue that might have come right off a carnival stage, but not even the boldest of our absurdist playwrights would present in a tragic drama, we've been shocked out of sense and sensibility. We are invited to laugh, even while we are filled with revulsion. Of such sudden ambivalences is Don Giovanni made. Then the orchestra strikes up again, and we feel ourselves back on familiar operatic ground. This is tragic, surely, and we are meant to feel sorry for the bereaved Donna Anna and her chivalrous fiancé, Don Ottavio. They enter with servants and torches, and piercing dissonances announce that they have discovered the body of the commendatore. Anna falls on her father's corpse and faints. Ottavio calls for help, has the body taken away, and tries to bring his fiancée to her senses, when, recovering, she momentarily mistakes him for the unknown man who has killed her father. He tells her tenderly she will now have both a father and a husband in him. But she, a true Spanish noblewoman, wants vengeance, and he joins her in swearing it. Here are Luigi Alva and Joan Sutherland. Next, as the dawn comes up, we are with Don Giovanni and Leporello fleeing down the street, the master bullying the servant into silence, boasting but intent on getting safely away to his nearby castle, till, in front of an inn, he senses the presence of a woman. Nostrils and imagination alone tell him she is beautiful. The 2 men hide to map out the territory, and the lady appears, Donna Elvira, in the person of Elizabeth Schwarzkopf. The music implies that, beautiful though Elvira is, there might be something slightly dotty about her. She is, in fact, a character midway between opera seria and opera buffa, what Mozart called mezzo carattere, by turns serious and comic, and sometimes both at once. Just now she's threatening to tear the heart out of the man who has loved and left her. But does the music ask us to take her seriously? "Poor girl," says Giovanni. "I'll have to console her." And then, too late, he finds she's a lady he has recently loved and left, back in Burgos. Elvira proclaims herself the instrument of a just and punishing heaven. Leporello says she talks like a book. Giovanni makes a quick escape and leaves Elvira to his servant. In a puppet play we might laugh at the lady, but our feelings for her here are ambivalent. Molière, who invented the character, made it clear that she was a nun back in Burgos. In Da Ponte, there are indications that Giovanni actually married her there to have his way with her. If we take her plight seriously, Edward Dent says, Elvira's degradation is horrible. The laws of comedy would insist we not take her seriously. But Mozart will not have it that way. Before the opera is over, his musical portrait of Elvira, delicately balanced between acute observation and sympathy, makes our finest critic, Andrew Porter, weep for her. Weep, he says, while around me some of the audience is laughing. Of such ambivalences is Don Giovanni made. Leporello then gets his famous catalogue aria. He unrolls the list of his master's conquests, 2,065 of them, in various parts of Europe and Asia. Spain, of all lands, is in the lead so far, with 1,003 conquests. The list includes peasant girls and servant girls, countesses, baronesses, marchionesses, and princesses, blondes for their sweetness, brunettes for their constancy, plump ones in winter, slim ones in summer, the majestic giantess, and the mere slip of a girl, and older ones, too, for the pleasure of adding them to the list. Such cataloguing is a comic device as old as Aristophanes, familiar from the Commedia dell'arte, done to a T by Gilbert and Sullivan, but no one has ever done it better than Mozart and Da Ponte here. The aria is happily heartless, with the librettist's censorable lines made completely acceptable, even in this feminist's age, by the elegance and wit of the music.
Madamina, il catalogo è questo, delle belle che amo il padron mio, un catalogo quelli è che ho fatt'io. Osservate, leggete con me, osservate, leggete con me. In Italia 640, in Albania 231, 100 in Francia, in Turchia 91, ma in Spagna son già 1.300.
Don Giovanni has now fled the city and is making for his castle when, in the early morning, he espies a rustic party on their way to a wedding. In Mörike's short story, it was this music that came into Mozart's head as he plucked that symbolic orange and remembered the Italian maidens and youths he once saw at their love games. Our maiden and youth here are Graziella Sciuti and Piero Cappuccilli.
Giovinetti leggeri di testa, non andate girando di là e qua e là e qua e là. Poco dura dei matti la festa, ma per me cominciato non ha. Che piacer che sarà.
He is Mazzetto, and she is the adorable Zerlina. One of the questions often asked at performances of Don Giovanni is, who is the leading lady? In our century, we often think that it must be Donna Elvira, for she embodies the opera's serious and comic elements at once. In the 19th century, there was no question that the opera seria figure Donna Anna was the leading female role, especially after E.T.A. Hoffmann told one of his spookiest tales about her. But in the 18th century, Mozart's century, it was assumed that the feminine lead was this third soprano, straight out of opera buffa, the pretty peasant girl Zerlina. She tells us she is going to marry Mazzetto, but will she? Don Giovanni shows an interest in the wedding party and invites them all up to his villa. Leporello will show them the master's gardens, rooms, and etchings. Giovanni himself will escort Zerlina, and Mazzetto need not worry. She will be with a cavalier. Mazzetto is suspicious, but there is nothing he, a lowly peasant, can do. Zerlina, alone with Giovanni, has suspicions too. I know, she says, that you cavaliers are not often honest and sincere with women. That's just a lower-class rumor, says Giovanni, as he looks into her eyes. I want to marry you. And he breaks down all her defenses in the little love duet, La ci darem la mano. It is perhaps the most famous number in the score. Beethoven and Chopin wrote variations on it, and Liszt worked it prominently into his Don Juan fantasy. It is what Dorian Gray, in the film version, cannot miss hearing at the opera the night after his first seduction. And in James Joyce's Ulysses, it haunts that cuckolded Mazzetto Leopold Bloom, for his wife and her lover sing it and carry it to its physical conclusion. By this time we really should hate Giovanni, and yet no one seems to. So artlessly does Mozart combine the man's aristocratic bearing and the girl's pastoral shyness in this charming duettino.
La ci darem la mano, ma mi dirai di sì, vedi non è lontano, partiamo io da qui.
But before Giovanni can get away with Zerlina, the overwrought Elvira is there to tell the peasant girl the truth about her supposedly chivalrous escort. That aria sounds like Handel at his most religious, appropriately enough for this lady seduced from a convent. There is something of the avenging angel about Elvira, though Giovanni says, as the angel hurries the peasant girl away, "The devil is amusing himself today. He's interfering with my pleasures." Then suddenly Anna is there, with Ottavio. They do not at first think that Giovanni, a gentleman and a friend of Anna's noble family, could be the man they have been tracking. But they grow suspicious soon enough when Elvira reappears to accuse Giovanni of his many sins. The quartet that follows, cast in sonata form, traces the dawning of Anna's opera seria suspicions as Giovanni insists in opera buffa style that Elvira is quite mad.
Lasciatemi con lei, forse si calmerà, forse si calmerà.
Non credete a dirfino?
È pazza, non badate.
Chiude l'estate.
È pazza. Qualche cosa sospettare.
Ma qui c'è
Something in Giovanni's voice stirs a question, a memory in Anna, and when she is left alone with her Ottavio, she is sure. It was Don Giovanni who killed her father. Mozart lets his orchestra show the emergence of the terrible realization in her mind.
Cos'è stato?
Mio bene, fate coraggio.
Did Giovanni have his way with Anna? Did she yield to him willingly? These are questions everyone asks. Anna says that at first she thought the stranger who entered her room was Ottavio. In one source, Bertotti, it is clear they had arranged to meet, perfectly respectably. Then she says that when she saw the man was not her fiancé, she screamed and fought him off. But for more than a century, commentators have wondered if she is telling the truth. In another source, Tirso, the lady did yield willingly. Da Ponte, carelessly or cunningly, leaves the matter open. Whatever the truth, Anna now cries out for vengeance on Giovanni, both for her father's spilt blood and for the attempt on her honor. Her aria, Or sai che l'onore, shows that Anna in anger can hold her own with any of the goddesses and furies of the opere serie of the past. You can see why Hoffmann, in his tale, called her a divine woman, over whose pure spirit evil is powerless. Ottavio is concerned at what this terrible desire for vengeance is doing to his Anna. Mozart added an aria here for the Vienna production, where the Ottavio couldn't manage his aria in the second act. Now no one wants to do without either of the tenor arias, the famous Il mio tesoro in Act 2, or the quiet Dalla sua pace that comes here, usually in front of the curtain. Meanwhile, up in the castle, Leporello tells Giovanni that he's managed to start the rustics drinking, to calm Mazzetto down, and, yes, to get Zerlina inside while contriving to lock Elvira out. Then Giovanni sings what the Germans have convinced us should be called the champagne aria, something of a misnomer, as I'm told that good champagne is hardly to be had in Spain. Baritones usually try to get through the champagne aria as quickly as amateur pianists race through what they call Chopin's minute waltz, another misnomer. These few dizzying measures are important, however. They are as close to a portrait of our hero as Mozart ever allows us. "Let all the dances be mixed up," Giovanni shouts to Leporello, "and bring in all the girls you can find. I want to make love to them all behind the scenes. Tomorrow there'll be at least 10 new names for the list."
Calda la testa, una festa da preparar. Centro di piazza qualche ragazza, teca con quella cerca menar, teca con quella cerca menar, cerca menar, cerca menar. Senza corri la gnana sia, il minuetto, la follia, la nana, farà balar, il minuetto, farà balar, la follia, farà balar, la nana, farà balar. E ti offro tanto dall'altro canto, con questa quella uomoreggiar, uomoreggiar, uomoreggiar. Tagliame lisa, come mattina, una vicina devi aumentar. Tagliame lisa, una vicina devi aumentar. Centro di piazza, qualche ragazza, teca, quella cerca menar. Tagliame lisa, come mattina, una vicina devi aumentar. Senza colorine la lancia, minuetto, fila, fila, nevada, fare balar. Tagliame lisa, come mattina, una decina devi aumentare, una decina devi aumentare, una decina devi aumentare, devi aumentare, devi aumentare, devi aumentare.
In Giovanni's garden, where Leporello has enclosed the by now quite drunk country boys and girls, Zerlina tries to make up with Mazzetto. She says that nothing has happened between her and Giovanni at all, but if it makes Mazzetto feel any better, he can beat her. By the end of her aria, Batti, Batti, beat me, dear Mazzetto, her bridegroom-to-be is putty in her hands, and ornamental cellos are prancing bucolically around her song. Then, after Giovanni has called all the peasants inside for what he hopes will be a very unorthodox celebration of Zerlina's wedding, 3 uninvited guests appear in the garden below. They are clearly not peasants, but aristocrats, wearing Venetian-style masks, familiar in our day from their use in Amadeus, and great flowing cloaks that make it impossible to tell whether the wearers are men or women. Only their voices tell us that they are Anna and Ottavio, bent on revenge, and Elvira, who has led the way for them. From the window above, we hear the first strains of the famous Don Giovanni minuet, and Leporello, who has been told to invite one and all to the party, looks down and bids the masked visitors come inside the castle, and they accept.
Signor, guardate un poco, che maschere galanti, al passar avanti, vita ci fanno l'or.
Al volto e dalla voce si scopre il traditore.
Signore maschere,
Mi rispondete,
signore maschere,
cosa chiedete?
al ballo se vi piace, vi invita il mio signor.
Grazie di tanto onore, andiamo compagne belle.
L'amico anche su quelle prove farà d'amor.
Then, in a superb moment, the 3 avengers pray to heaven to protect them, for the justice they must deal out terrifies them.
Mio
At last we are inside Don Giovanni's castle. The word he uses, casino, can also mean brothel. The dancing is underway, and Giovanni has begun his conquest of Zerlina, when trumpets and drums announce the arrival of the 3 masked aristocrats. Everyone wonders who they are. Don Giovanni shouts, "Viva la libertà!" and all the characters on stage repeat that phrase in a series of remarkable flourishes. For Giovanni, liberty means, of course, license, his freedom to have his way with all his now captive women. For Leporello, it means the freedom to cavort as freely as his master. For Zerlina, it means the freedom, if she dares, to give herself to a seigneur who might raise her to his station. For Mazzetto, it means the freedom to fight for what is rightly his. For Elvira, Anna, and Ottavio, it means the freedom their masks have given them to enter this den of iniquity and unmask the seducer and murderer. Viva la libertà! The battle lines are drawn. So, too, in a magical 2 minutes of music, are the social lines. Don Giovanni had requested that all the dances be mixed up. Now they are. The minuet strikes up again, and while the 3 aristocrats dance, Giovanni and Leporello plot the seduction of Zerlina. Then, as the minuet continues, a second little orchestra on stage plays a contradance, and Don Giovanni uses it to lead Zerlina aside. Finally, after tuning up, a third little orchestra provides a clumsy Deutscher, or German dance, so Leporello can lead the befuddled Mazzetto off in the other direction. Eventually, all 3 dances in 3 different times, 3/4, 2/4, and 3/8, play simultaneously. But let's start earlier in the proceedings with the minuet.
Va bene, va bene, va bene in verità. Guardate, Mazzetto, non falli poveretto, poveretto, il tuo compagno solo, Mazzetto, Zerlina, Zerlina, c'è purtroppo. No, ballare non voglio,
Suddenly everyone hears from the next room Zerlina crying for help. Ottavio breaks down the door and reveals Don Giovanni, sword drawn, dragging Leporello, denouncing him as the would-be rapist. But no one is fooled. The maskers unmask, Ottavio protects the ladies with a pistol, they have caught Giovanni red-handed, and sing that heaven's thunder will strike him down that very day. Modern directors, following 19th century leads, try at this point to stage an escape for Giovanni, or arrange for a supernatural thunderstorm to strike the castle and throw the whole scene into confusion. But in Mozart and Da Ponte, who are more 18th century, or perhaps more modern, the action simply freezes, and everyone sings about the tempest that soon will strike. Giovanni's words at this end of Act 1 are, "Though the world should fall apart, nothing could make me fear." Before we discuss Act 2 of Don Giovanni, let's say a word about its librettist, Lorenzo da Ponte, who lies buried in Manhattan somewhere below 11th Street between First Avenue and Avenue A, though you'll find no grave marker there for this altogether remarkable scoundrel, who ended his days a U.S. citizen, absolved of his many sins by the Bishop of New York. His life was a curious succession of successes and failures. Da Ponte wrote the elegant texts for Mozart's Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, and over 30 other libretti for the Salieris of his day. And as the days dwindled down, he penned his memoirs. He was, by turns, Jewish student, Catholic priest, international adventurer, indefatigable roue, falling out of favor with the authorities in Venice, and then Vienna, and then London, with lesser mishaps to his credit in Dresden, Trieste, Paris, and Amsterdam, he came to this country, where, amid many failures in the merchandising of, successively, groceries, tobacco, liquor, medicines, dry goods, millinery, and books, he was helped to a professorship of Italian literature at Columbia University by Clement Clark Moore, the author of The Night Before Christmas. And he brought to these shores the famous Manuel Garcia, his son Manuel, and his soon-to-be famous daughter Maria Malibran, to present the first Italian opera in New York. But none of these ventures could be counted a complete success, and there were many more failures. Perhaps if the picaresque life of this gifted fugitive from justice hadn't been lived, it would have had to be invented to explain Don Giovanni. Act 2 of Don Giovanni seems at first to be a loose, episodic repetition of events from Act 1, and Da Ponte has come in for a fair amount of criticism for it. But when you read the sources, it is clear that the hard-pressed librettist has, with considerable skill, brought several diffuse strains together to make Act 2 a kind of recapitulation and resolution of Act 1. We are back in the street, before the inn where Elvira is staying. It is night. The same eventful day we've just been through is drawing to a close. Once again, Leporello is ready to leave his master's service. It's too dangerous. But he'll stay if the master will leave the women alone. "Leave the women alone!" Giovanni exclaims. "Are you mad? They're more necessary to me than the bread I eat, the air I breathe." Asked whether he must betray them all, he says, "To be faithful to one is to be cruel to the rest. I've been blessed with an overabundance of passion. I have to love them all. I can't help it if women can't think clearly and regard my natural feelings as betrayal." Accordingly, he proceeds to seduce Donna Elvira's maid. He and Leporello swap hats and cloaks. Elvira comes out on her balcony. Leporello mimes a serenade, while Giovanni, in the shadows, sings the words, and, like a puppet master, moves the servant's arms so that he gives the impression of being a gentleman. Elvira is fooled into thinking the servant is the master, mad with love for her. She descends, and Leporello lures her around the corner. For a while he will have the opportunity he wanted at the beginning of Act 1, to play the gentleman. Then Giovanni, looking like Leporello, sings another serenade to the maid. "Come to the window, please. If I don't get some relief, I'll die before your eyes."
Vieni alla finestra, o mio tesoro, e vieni a consolar il pianto mio. Se neghi a me di dar qualche ristoro, davanti agli occhi tuoi morirò io.
But once again, on this last day of his life, Giovanni is foiled. Mazzetto and a peasant posse suddenly appear to kill, if they can, the nobleman who invited them to his scandalous party and tried to rape the bride-to-be. They find him, too, but disguised. In the darkness they think he is Leporello. Giovanni, his life in danger, acts Leporello to the hilt and sends the posse off after the master. Then, when he has Mazzetto alone, he talks him out of his weapons, beats him up, leaves him in the street, and runs off laughing. Zerlina, perhaps knowing in advance that her bumptious bridegroom was going to get into trouble, appears with a lantern, checks out all the parts of Mazzetto that hurt, and, for medicinal purposes, lets him feel where her heart is beating. Then, around the corner, we are in a courtyard with 3 doors, part of Donna Anna's great house. It's time for an extended sextet. Leporello lures Elvira through one door, then tries to give her the slip through the second, just as, to torchlight and muted trumpets, Anna and Ottavio enter through it, on their way to the grave of her father. Leporello tries the third door, and is confronted there by Zerlina and Mazzetto. Everyone fastens on the man they think is Don Giovanni, and suddenly they are all astonished to find, in Giovanni's hat and cloak, only Leporello. Here we can mark the immense difference between the operas of Mozart and those of his predecessors. In the greatest of those, Handel, characters are defined by long solo arias, and rarely, if ever, combine their voices. In Mozart, solo arias also define the characters, but we learn at least as much about them in the ensembles, where each character is further defined in terms of the others. In this ensemble, as the 6 different voices weave their separate lines like 6 instruments in chamber music, the feeling is comic and serious in turns, and sometimes both at the same time. For each separate personage remains completely in character, coloring and colored by the others.
Amen.
Leporello finally gets out through the third door in the courtyard. Anna leaves to mourn her father, and in his finest moment, Ottavio exhorts the others to comfort her. This is the courtly and demanding aria Il mio tesoro, a perennial test for the rare tenor who can sing long-breathed phrases, and the rarer tenor who can find the manly strength that lies in the aristocratic delicacy of Mozart's musical line. Mozart added 2 numbers at this point to provide his Vienna singers with additional opportunities, and one of them is so beautiful that virtually all productions today include it. Elvira, always something of a visionary, seems to see heaven crashing above and hell opening beneath the man she loves. Though he has betrayed her, she pities him and prays for him, and soon woodwind phrases, echoing her circular melody, suggest the halo around the head of some suffering medieval saint. We can't help but have noticed by now that while the other characters are given these large-scale, introspective, self-revealing pieces to sing, Don Giovanni himself gets only the slightest of arias. He is almost opaque, a hero defined not by himself, but by those he pursues and is pursued by. Nothing could be more different from the old concept of Handelian opera seria, and that may be the single most innovative aspect of Mozart's opera. The hero is defined by the arias others sing. He does, however, define himself in the extroverted recitatives. As the harpsichord strikes up for more quick dialogue, we pass beyond the wall of Anna's courtyard. Giovanni nimbly leaps it. "What a night!" he exclaims, "just made for chasing girls." He hears Leporello grumbling outside the wall and invites him in through a portal, bragging how easy it is to make love to women when they think he's a commoner. He claims he's just taken advantage of a woman who thought he was Leporello. "Hey, what if that was my wife?" the servant asks. "Even better," laughs Giovanni, and his cruel laughter summons up a mysterious sound, a bass voice from nowhere singing, "By dawn you'll have laughed for the last time." "Who's there?" Giovanni calls. The voice seems to be issuing from a great Baroque statue of the Commendatore. This is his house, and it is now clear we are standing in his courtyard at his grave. Leporello gets a little nervous, especially when his master makes him read the inscription at the base of the statue, and it says, "Here I await vengeance on the blasphemer who sent me to my death." Giovanni laughs still more, and, as the orchestra starts up again, he forces Leporello at sword point to invite the statue to dinner. The statue nods assent. The scene is a locus classicus for the blending of opera buffa at its most buffoonish and opera seria at its most frighteningly serious. Here is the end of the scene, another trio for three deep male voices, beginning at the point where Giovanni himself invites the statue to dinner. There is one last scene before we leave the environs of Donna Anna's house, and that is her great accompanied recitative, Crudele, and aria Non mi dir. Anna tells Ottavio he ought not to think her cruel if she does not respond to his affections. She does love him, and heaven will soon come to help her, but we sense in the truly beautiful music that neither he nor she can understand what is really in her heart. Can Anna really love Ottavio after she has been attacked and her father murdered by Giovanni? Twice she has mistaken Ottavio for him, the man who haunts her imagination and memory. Perhaps now is the time to venture a thought on why Mozart's opera exerts such a disconcerting power. Its hero, whom we are never allowed really to know, seems to know us, or at least he knows something vulnerable about all the characters that confront him. He senses that vulnerability and exploits it in the men as well as the women. They are all reduced to fixed attitudes and wonder about what he makes them feel. In this he is a real seducer. He makes the other characters see themselves in their weaknesses. They call one another cruel, but he is the cruel one. He seems to see unflinchingly into their souls. No wonder they want revenge. And yet there is something profoundly liberating about discovering oneself. At the climax of Act I, the characters wear masks, and the man they are advancing against prompts them to sing Viva la Libertà. He is the only one in their world who can give them a proper sense of their own individualities. No wonder they pursue him. In the final scene, a scene to parallel the one with the masks at the end of Act I, we are back in Giovanni's castle. He is already dining, and Leporello is serving him, and his private orchestra, which had played 3 tunes simultaneously before, plays 3 tunes successively now. 3 tunes familiar from operas of Mozart's day, all of which Leporello, apparently an opera fan, knows very well. Mozart encouraged his performers to improvise jests at this point, so servant and master exchange puns and jokes over hit tunes from Cosa Rara by Martini Soler, I Due Litiganti by Giuseppe Sarti, and finally Le Nozze di Figaro by Mozart himself. Audiences in Prague must have burst out laughing here. Giovanni, the 21-year-old Luigi Bassi, had been their count in Figaro the year before, and Leporello, Felice Ponziani, had been Figaro himself. He'd made the aria Non più andrai the year's biggest hit. Now, when he hears again the tune he'd sent to the top of the charts, he turns to the audience and sings, "That's a tune I know only too well." Suddenly Elvira appears, in what proves to be a last-minute attempt to persuade Giovanni to change his life. She is the first, and then it is Leporello's turn, to see the statue inexorably approaching. Boldly Giovanni faces his fate as Elvira flees and Leporello cowers under the table. The music returns to the sinister D minor passage in the overture, yet Mozart daringly keeps the comic element interacting with the serious, as another trio for 3 dark male voices begins. The statue bursts open the doors, singing, "Don Giovanni, you invited me to dinner, and I have come."
Avrei giammai creduto, ma farò quel che potrò. Leporello, altra cena, sa che subito si perdi. Padron, padron, siam tutti morti. Amnetica! Diceva celeste
Now that the statue has accepted Don Giovanni's invitation, will he accept the statue's invitation to dine with him in the hereafter? He will, but he will not repent of his dissolute life, even when the threatening statue grips his hand. It is a moment of splendid bravado, and the music, even to ears that have heard Wagner and Strauss and Schoenberg, is genuinely frightening. In Merica's story, Mozart tells his listeners that only when he had finished composing this scene did he realize that his candle had burnt out in his hand, leaving it coated with wax, and he entertained for a chilling moment the idea of his own death. Then Giovanni's hand is released. Flames rise up around him. Unseen voices chant that he is damned, and he sinks in the flames as, in some productions at least, his castle crumbles around him. The first of those screams is Giovanni descending to his opera seria death. The second is Leporello under the table, scared out of his opera buffa wits. In Moliere's version, Leporello rushes to the trap door on stage and shouts down, "Hey, what about my wages?" I wish Mozart and Da Ponte had kept that. It would fit, because now, as if in answer to the two screams, we hear two unceremonious whoops from the orchestra. There's no question that the opera seria is quickly turning buffa. It's become a tradition to turn the house lights up at this moment, or to play What Remains before the curtain. What Remains is a little scene that the 19th century chose to omit, thinking it unsuitable for tragedy, and claiming, with some justification, that Mozart himself once cut it. But the 18th century wanted it, a kind of vaudeville, wherein the characters advance in turn to the footlights and speak to the audience directly. And we today want it too, for its final juxtaposition of opera seria and buffa. Life returns to normal for our characters. Anna and Ottavio will marry after a year's period of mourning. Elvira will return to her convent. Zerlina and Mazzetto will settle down merrily, and Leporello, back where he started, will look for a new master. Finally, to a rapid, quasi-religious double fugue, the six characters point the moral for us, though, of course, we need take it no more seriously than would any Don Juan audience through the centuries watching a morality play at a carnival. This is the way evildoers end. The death of sinners always suits the life they lead. Mozart's final touch is what critic Alan Rich called that last little trail of stardust that the orchestra showers over the stage as the singers round off their adventure. It seems to me to say, you make of all this what you will. Clearly, this mercurial drama, with its vivid yet elusive characters, is something more than its creators, its performers, its admirers, and its few detractors have been able to say. Because its roots are in the puppet theater, the opera's characters are, to some extent, puppets. But Mozart makes the puppets sing music to break the heart. Because it is part morality play, it is clearly about sex, yet there is a strange innocence and an even stranger intimation of wisdom about it. Its hero, who is promiscuous, treacherous, and murderous, comes to represent what is most dangerously attractive in a man to three very different kinds of women, and perhaps, too, what every man would like to be if only he dared. For those ambiguities, and for the perception that a human being is defined not so much by what he is himself as by his constantly shifting relationships with others, and for the sense that man, fatally flawed, is most a man when, like Hamlet or Faust, he confronts boldly whatever power it is that moves the world beyond him. For all of these in Don Giovanni, it is Mozart's music, ever shifting from mysteriously serious to joyously comic, that is responsible. That music tells us, with sometimes cruel but cleansing insight, about ourselves. In a past age, a romantic poet like de Musset could call the opera's hero a marvelous symbol of man on earth. In our more existentialist age, none of us can really see ourselves as that hero. None of us has been blessed or cursed with his superabundant sexuality. But creatures of flesh we nonetheless are, driven by that irrational force he represents. Today we see ourselves as the other figures in the opera, those pathetic figures the hero leads on and unmasks and reveals in all their vulnerability. We human beings are comic and tragic at once in our utter dependence on love. Our predicament would be comic did we not suffer so much pain from our fleshly yearning. So Mozart's prismatic opera keeps to the simple lesson of the old cautionary tale about the wages of sin, but shifts the emphasis from the sinner to the sinned against. Written in the age of reason, it tempers its rationalism with that truest of insights, compassion. And Mozart, lavishing on his characters music of unparalleled understanding and sensitivity, comes at last to seem a kind of omniscient Prospero, or, as some of our best thinkers have not hesitated to say, a kind of God. That's a view of Don Giovanni we owe to Kierkegaard, or Shaw, or that tale of E.T. Amadeus Hoffmann. But I'd like to end with the words Edward Merica uses in his story, as Mozart, on the journey to Prague, sits poised to play for the people at the Orangery the climax of his new opera. The manuscript lies open on the piano, the candles burning. The men and women sit breathlessly waiting for the scene with the statue to begin. At such times, Merica says, a person longs to be lifted out of his ordinary self, and yet he is afraid. He has the feeling that infinity will touch him and draw his soul unto itself. That exaltation, Merica says, experiencing a miracle that is of God, yet somehow also a part of oneself, that is perhaps the happiest and purest feeling any one of us can ever know. Then, in the story, Mozart starts to play Don Giovanni, and his listeners know that infinity has touched them.